Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. I must apologise for my recent absence over the last week or so. Things haven't been that great here, but as part of trying to improve them, I thought it might be nice to get back into reading, and I've got a little bit of time now to do so. So, sorry to all three of my readers, but here we go again, I guess, and I hope you enjoy the update. As a little bit of a recap, since it's been a while, what has been going on? Cecilia is trying to get away from the Harrels. Mr. Harrel is in real financial distress at this point, and Cecilia has just received news that she can come and stay at with the Delviles from Mrs. Delvile. It's now the 12th of June, and she is going to leave on the 13th. Chapter 10. A Gamester's Conscience. From this soothing prospect, Cecilia was presently disturbed by Mrs. Harrel's maid, who came to entreat she would hasten to her lady, whom she feared was going into fits. Cecilia flew to her immediately, and found her in the most violent affliction. She used every kind effort in her power to quiet and console her, but it was not without the utmost difficulty she could sob out the cause of this fresh sorrow, which indeed was not trifling. Mr. Harrel, she said, had told her he could not possibly raise money even for his travelling expenses without risking a discovery of his project, and being seized by his creditors. He had therefore charged her, through her brother or her friend, to procure for him £3,000, as less would not suffice to maintain them while abroad, and he knew no method by which he could have any remittances without danger. And when she hesitated in her compliance, he furiously accused her of having brought on all this distress by her negligence and want of management, and declared that if she did not get the money, she would only be served as she merited by starving in a foreign jail, which he swore would be the fate of them both. The horror and indignation with which Cecilia heard this account were unspeakable. She saw evidently that she was again to be played upon by terror and distress, and the cautions and opinions of Mr. Monckton no longer appeared overstrained. 1 year's income was already demanded. The annuity in the country house might next be required. She rejoiced, however, that thus wisely forewarned she was not liable to surprise, and she determined by their entreaties or representations, but what they might, to be immovably steady in her purpose of leaving them the next morning. Yet she could not but grieve at suffering the whole burthen of this clamorous imposition to fall upon the soft-hearted Mr. Arnold, whose inability to resist solicitation made him so unequal to sustaining its weight. But when Mrs. Harrel was again able to go on with her account, she heard to her infinite surprise that all application to her brother had proved fruitless. "He will not hear me," continued Mrs. Harrel, "and he never was deaf to me before. So now I have lost my only and last resource. My brother himself gives me up, and there is no one else upon earth who will assist me." "With pleasure, with readiness, with joy," cried Cecilia, "should you find assistance from me, were it to you alone it were given. But to supply fuel for the very fire that is consuming you. No, no, my whole heart is hardened against gaming and gamesters, and neither now or ever will I suffer any consideration to soften me in their favour." Mrs. Harrel only answered by tears and lamentations, and Cecilia, whose justice shut not out compassion, having now declared her purposed firmness, again attempted to soothe her, entreating her not to give way to such immoderate grief, since better prospects might arise from the very gloom now before her, and a short time spent in solitude and economy might enable her to return to her native land with recovered happiness. "No, I shall never return," cried she, weeping. "I shall die, I shall break my heart before I've been banished a month. Oh, Miss Beverley, how happy you are, able to stay where you please, rich, rolling in wealth which you do not want, of which had we but 1 year's income only, all this misery would be over, and we might stay in our dear, dear country." Cecilia, struck by a hint that so nearly bordered upon reproach, and offended by seeing the impossibility of ever doing enough, while anything remained to be done, forbore not without difficulty inquiring what next was expected from her, and whether any part of her fortune might be guarded, without giving room for son's censure. But the deep affliction of Mrs. Harrel soon removed her resentment, and scarcely thinking her, while in a state of such wretchedness answerable for what she said. After a little recollection, she mildly replied, "As affluence is all comparative, you may at present think I have more than my share. But the time is only this moment past when your own situation seemed as subject to the envy of others as mine may be now. My future destiny is yet undetermined, and the occasion I may have for my fortune is unknown to myself. But whether I possess it in peace or in turbulence, whether it proves to me a blessing or an injury, so long as I can call it my own, I shall always remember with alacrity the claim upon that and upon me which early friendship had so justly given Mrs. Harrel. Yet permit me at the same time to add, that I do not hold myself so entirely independent as you may probably suppose me. I have not, it is true, any relations to call me to account, but respect for their memory supplies the place of their authority, and I cannot, in the distribution of the fortune which is devolved to me, forbear sometimes considering how they would have wished it would be spent, and always remembering that what was acquired by industry and labour should never be dissipated in idleness and vanity. Forgive me for thus speaking to the point. You will not find me less friendly to yourself for this frankness with respect to your situation." Tears were again the only answer of Mrs. Harrel, yet Cecilia, who pitied the weakness of her mind, stayed by her with the most patient kindness till the servants announced dinner. She then declared she would not go downstairs, but Cecilia so strongly represented the danger of awakening suspicion in the servants, that she at last prevailed with her to make her appearance. Mr. Harrel was already in the parlour, and inquiring for Mr. Arnott, but was told by the servants he had sent word he had another engagement. Sir Robert Floyer also kept away, and for the first time since her arrival in town, Cecilia dined with no other company but the master and mistress of the house. Mrs. Harrel could eat nothing. Cecilia, merely to avoid creating surprise in the servants, forbore following her example, but Mr. Harrel ate much as usual, talked all dinner time, was extremely civil to Cecilia, and discovered not by his manners the least alteration in his affairs. When the servants were gone, he desired his wife to step for a moment with him into the library. They soon returned, and then by Mr. Harrel, after walking in a disordered manner about the room, rang the bell, and ordered his hat and cane, and as he took them said, "If this fails," and stopping short without speaking to his wife or even bowing to Cecilia, he hastily went out of the house. Mrs. Harrel told Cecilia that he had merely called her to know the event of her 2 petitions, and had heard her double failure in total silence. Whither he was now gone it was not easy to conjecture, nor what was the new resource which he still seemed to think worth trying, but the manner of his quitting the house, and the threat implied by "if this fails," contributed not to lessen the grief of Mrs. Harrel, and gave to Cecilia herself the utmost alarm. They continued together till tea time, the servants having been ordered to admit no company. Mr. Harrel himself then returned, and returned to the amazement of Cecilia, accompanied by Mr. Marriott. He presented that young man to both the ladies as a gentleman whose acquaintance and friendship he was very desirous to cultivate. Mrs. Harrel, too much absorbed in her own affairs to care about any other, saw his entrance with a momentary surprise, and then thought of it no more. But it was not so with Cecilia, whose better understanding led her to deeper reflection. Even the visits of Mr. Marriott but a few weeks since Mr. Harrel had prohibited, yet he now introduced him into his house with particular distinction. He came back, too, himself in admirable spirits, enlivened in his countenance and restored to his good humour. A change so extraordinary both in conduct and disposition convinced her that some change no less extraordinary of circumstance must previously have happened. What that might be it was not possible for her to divine, but the lessons she had received from Mr. Monckton led her to suspicions of the darkest kind. Every part of his behaviour seemed still further to confirm them. He was civil even to excess to Mr. Marriott. He gave orders aloud not to be at home to Sir Robert Floyer. He made his court to Cecilia with unusual assiduity, and he took every method in his power to procure opportunity to her admirer of addressing and approaching her. The young man, who seemed enamoured even to madness, could scarce refrain not merely from protestation to the object of his passion, but to Mr. Harrel himself for permitting him to see her. Cecilia, who not without some concern perceived a fondness so fruitless, and who knew not by what arts or with what views Mr. Harrel might think proper to encourage it, determined to take all the means that were in her own power towards giving it immediate control. She behaved therefore with the utmost reserve, and the moment tea was over, though earnestly entreated to remain with them, she retired to her own room, without making any other apology than coldly saying she could not stay. In about an hour Mrs. Harrel ran upstairs to her. "Oh, Miss Beverley," she cried, "a little respite is now granted me. Mr. Harrel says he shall stay another day. He says too, single £1,000 would now make him a new man." Cecilia returned no answer. She conjectured some new deceit was in agitation to raise money, and she feared Mr. Marriott was the next dupe to be played upon. Mrs. Harrel, therefore, with a look of the utmost disappointment, left her, saying she would send for her brother, and once more try if he had yet any remaining regard for her. Cecilia rested quiet till 11 o'clock, when she was summoned to supper. She found Mr. Marriott still was the only guest, and that Mr. Arnott made not his appearance. She now resolved to publish her resolution of going the next morning to St. James's Square. As soon, therefore, as the servants withdrew, she inquired of Mr. Harrel if he had any commands of Mr. and Mrs. Delvile, as she should see them the next morning, and purposed to spend some time with them. Mr. Harrel, with a look of much alarm, asked if she meant the whole day. "Many days," she answered, "and probably many months." Mrs. Harrel exclaimed her surprise aloud, and Mr. Harrel looked aghast, while his new-found friend cast upon him a glance of reproach and resentment, which fully convinced Cecilia he imagined he had procured himself a title to an easiness of intercourse and frequency of meeting which this intelligence destroyed. Cecilia, thinking that all had passed, no other ceremony on her part was necessary, but that of simply speaking her intention, then arose and returned to her own room. She acquainted her maid that she was going to make a visit to Mrs. Delvile, and gave her directions about packing up her clothes, and sending for a man in the morning to take care of her books. This employment was soon interrupted by the entrance of Mrs. Harrel, who, desiring to speak with her alone, when the maid was gone, said, "Oh, Miss Beverley, can you indeed be so barbarous as to leave me?" "I entreat you, Mrs. Harrel," answered Cecilia, "to save both yourself and me any further discussions. I have delayed this removal very long, and I can now delay it no longer." Mrs. Harrel then flung herself upon a chair in the bitterest sorrow, declaring she was utterly undone, that Mr. Harrel had declared he could not stay even an hour in England if she was not in his house, that he had already had a violent quarrel with Mr. Marriott upon the subject, and that her brother, though she had sent him the most earnest entreaties, would not come near her. Cecilia, tired of vain attempts to offer comfort, now urged the warmest expostulations against her opposition, strongly representing the real necessity of her going abroad, and the unpardonable weakness of wishing to continue such a life as she now led, adding debt to debt, and hoarding distress upon distress. Mrs. Harrel then, though rather from compulsion than conviction, declared she would agree to go, if she had not a dread of ill usage. But Mr. Harrel, she said, had behaved to her with the utmost brutality, calling her the cause of his ruin, and threatening that if she procured not this £1,000 before the ensuing evening, she should be treated as she deserved for her extravagance and folly. "Does he think, then," said Cecilia with the utmost indignation, "that I am to be frightened through your fears into what compliances he pleases?" "Oh no," cried Mrs. Harrel, "no, his expectations are all from my brother. He surely thought that when I supplicated and pleaded to him, he would do what I wished, for so he always did formerly, and so once again I am sure he would do now, could I but make him come to me, and tell him how I am used, and tell him that if Mr. Harrel takes me abroad in this humour, I verily think in his rage he will half murder me." Cecilia, who well knew she was herself the real cause of Mr. Arnott's resistance, now felt her resolution waver, internally reproaching herself with the sufferings of his sister. Alarmed, however, for her own constancy, she earnestly besought Mrs. Harrel to go and compose herself for the night, and promised to deliberate what could be done for her before morning. Mrs. Harrel complied, but scarce was her own rest more broken than that of Cecilia, who, though extremely fatigued with a whole night's watching, was so perturbed in her mind she could not close her eyes. Mrs. Harrel was her earliest and had once been her dearest friend. She had deprived her by her own advice of her customary refuge in her brother. To refuse, therefore, assistance to her seemed cruelty, though to deny it to Mr. Harrel was justice. She endeavoured, therefore, to make a compromise between her judgment and compassion, by resolving that though she would grant nothing further to Mr. Harrel while he remained in London, she would contribute from time to time both to his necessities and comfort, when once he was established elsewhere, upon some plan of prudence and economy. Well, I think we have time for another chapter, and I'm afraid it's only going to get worse. Chapter 11. A Persecution. The next morning by 5 o'clock, Mrs. Harrel came into Cecilia's room to know the result of her deliberation, and Cecilia, with that graceful readiness which accompanied all her kind offices, instantly assured her the £1,000 should be her own, if she would consent to seek some quiet retreat, and receive it in small sums, of £50 or £100 at a time, which should be carefully transmitted, and which, by being delivered to herself, might secure better treatment from Mr. Harrel, and be a motive to revive his care and affection. She flew, much delighted, with this proposal to her husband, but presently, and with a dejected look returning, said Mr. Harrel protested he could not possibly set out without first receiving the money. "I shall go myself, therefore," said she, "to my brother after breakfast, for he will not, I see, unkind as he is grown, come to me, and if I do not succeed with him, I believe I shall never come back." To this Cecilia, offended and disappointed, answered, "I am sorry for Mr. Arnott, but for myself I have done." Mrs. Harrel then left her, and she arose to make immediate preparations for her removal to St. James's Square, whither, with all the speed in her power, she sent her books, her trunks, and all that belonged to her. When she was summoned downstairs, she found for the first time Mr. Harrel breakfasting at the same table with his wife. They seemed mutually out of humour and comfortless. Nothing hardly was spoken, and little was swallowed. Mr. Harrel, however, was civil, but his wife was totally silent, and Cecilia the whole time was planning how to take her leave. When the tea things were removed, Mr. Harrel said, "You have not, I hope, Miss Beverley, quite determined upon this strange scheme?" "Indeed I have, sir," she answered, "and already I have sent my clothes." At this information he seemed thunderstruck, but after somewhat recovering, said with much bitterness, "Well, madam, at least may I request you will stay here till the evening?" "No, sir," answered she coldly, "I am going instantly." "And will you not," said he with yet greater asperity, "amuse yourself first with seeing bailiffs take possession of my house, and your friend Priscilla follow me to jail?" "Good God, Mr. Harrel!" exclaimed Cecilia with uplifted hands, "is this a question, is this behaviour I have merited?" "Oh no," cried he with quickness, "should I once think that way." Then rising and striking his forehead, he walked about the room. Mrs. Harrel arose too, and weeping violently went away. "Will you at least," said Cecilia when she was gone, "till your affairs are settled, leave Priscilla with me? When I go into my own house she shall accompany me, and meantime Mr. Arnott's, I am sure, will gladly be open to her." "No, no," answered he, "she deserves no such indulgence. She has not any reason to complain. She has been as negligent, as profuse, as expensive as myself. She has practised neither economy nor self-denial. She has neither thought of me nor my affairs, nor is she now afflicted at anything but the loss of that affluence she has done her best towards diminishing." "All recrimination," said Cecilia, "were vain, or what might not Mrs. Harrel's urge in return? But let us not enlarge upon so ungrateful a subject. The wisest and the happiest scheme now were mutually and kindly to console each other." "Consolation and kindness," cried he with abruptness, "are out of the question. I have ordered a post-chaise to be here at night, and if till then you will stay, I will promise to release you without further petition. If not, eternal destruction be my portion if I live to see the scene which your removal will occasion." "My removal!" cried Cecilia, shuddering. "Good heaven! and how can my removal be of such dreadful consequence?" "Ask me not," cried he fiercely, "questions or reasons now. The crisis is at hand, and you will soon, happen what may, know all. Meantime, what I have said is a fact, and immutable, and you must hasten my end, or give me a chance for avoiding it, as you think fit. I scarce care at this instant which way you decide. Remember, however, all I ask of you is to defer your departure. What else I have to hope is from Mr. Arnott." He then left the room. Cecilia now was again a coward. In vain she called to her support the advice, the prophecies, the cautions of Mr. Monckton. In vain she recollected the impositions she had already seen practised, for neither the warnings of her counsellor nor the lessons of her own experience were proofs against the terrors which threats so desperate inspired. And though more than once she determined to fly at all events from a tyranny he had so little right to usurp, the mere remembrance of the words, "If you stay not till night, I will not live," robbed her of all courage. And however long she had prepared herself for this very attack, when the moment arrived, its power over her mind was too strong for resistance. While this conflict between fear and resolution was still undecided, her servant brought her the following letter from Mr. Arnott. To Miss Beverley, Portman Square, June 13th, 1779. Madam, determined to obey those commands which you had the goodness to honour me with, I have absented myself from town till Mr. Harrel is settled. For though I am as sensible of your wisdom as of your beauty, I find myself too weak to bear the distress of my unhappy sister, and therefore I run from the sight, nor shall any letter or message follow me, unless it comes from Miss Beverley herself, lest she should in future refuse the only favour I dare presume to solicit, that of sometimes deigning to honour with her directions the most humble and devoted of her servants, J. Arnott. In the midst of her apprehensions for herself and her own interest, Cecilia could not forbear rejoicing that Mr. Arnott, at least, had escaped the present storm. Yet she was certain it would fall the more heavily upon herself, and dreaded the sight of Mrs. Harrel after the shock which this flight would occasion. Her expectations were but too quickly fulfilled. Mrs. Harrel in a short time after rushed wildly into the room, calling out, "My brother is gone! He has left me for ever! Oh, save me, Miss Beverley! Save me from abuse and insult!" And she wept with so much violence she could utter nothing more. Cecilia, quite tortured by this persecution, faintly asked what she could do for her. "Send," cried she, "to my brother, and beseech him not to abandon me. Send to him and conjure him to advance this £1,000. The chaise is already ordered. Mr. Harrel is fixed upon going, yet he says without that money we must both starve in a strange land. Oh, send to my cruel brother. He has left word that nothing must follow him that does not come from you." "For the world, then," cried Cecilia, "would I not baffle his discretion? Indeed, you must submit to your fate. Indeed, Mrs. Harrel, you must endeavour to bear it better." Mrs. Harrel, shedding a flood of tears, declared she would try to follow her advice, but again besought her in the utmost agony to send after her brother, protesting she did not think even her life would be safe in making so long a journey with Mr. Harrel in his present state of mind. His character, she said, was totally changed. His gaiety, good humour, and sprightliness were turned into roughness and moroseness, and since his great losses at play, he was grown so fierce and furious, that to oppose him even in a trifle rendered him quite outrageous in passion. Cecilia, though truly concerned, and almost melted, yet refused to interfere with Mr. Arnott, and even thought it but justice to acknowledge she had advised his retreat. "And can you have been so cruel," cried Mrs. Harrel, with still increasing violence of sorrow, "to rob me of my only friend, to deprive me of my brother's affection, at the very time I am forced out of the kingdom, with a husband who is ready to murder me, and who says he hates the sight of me, and all because I cannot get him this fatal money? Oh, Miss Beverley, how could I have thought to have had such an office from you?" Cecilia was beginning a justification, when a message came from Mr. Harrel desiring to see his wife immediately. Mrs. Harrel, in great terror, cast herself at Cecilia's feet, and clinging to her knees, called out, "I dare not go to him! I dare not go to him! He wants to know my success, and when he has heard my brother is run away, I am sure he will kill me. Oh, Miss Beverley, how could you send him away? How could you be so inhuman as to leave me to the rage of Mr. Harrel?" Cecilia, distressed and trembling herself, conjured her to rise and be consoled, but Mrs. Harrel, weak and frightened, could only weep and supplicate. "I don't ask you," she cried, "to give me your money yourself, but only to send for my brother, that he may protect me, and beg Mr. Harrel not to treat me so cruelly. Consider but what a long journey I am going to make. Consider how often you used to say you would love me for ever. Consider you have robbed me of the tenderest brother in the world. Oh, Miss Beverley, send for him back, or be a sister to me yourself, and let not your poor Priscilla leave her native land without help or pity." Cecilia, wholly overcome, now knelt too, and embracing her with tears, said, "Oh, Priscilla, plead and reproach no more. What you wish shall be yours. I will send for your brother. I will do what you please." "Now you are my friend indeed," cried Mrs. Harrel. "Let me but see my brother, and his heart will yield to my distress, and he will soften Mr. Harrel by giving his unhappy sister this parting bounty." Cecilia then took a pen in her hand to write to Mr. Arnott, but struck almost in the same moment with a notion of treachery in calling him from a retreat which her own counsel had made him seek, professedly to expose him to a supplication which from his present situation might lead him to ruin. She hastily flung it from her, and exclaimed, "No, excellent Mr. Arnott, I will not so unworthily betray you." "And can you, Miss Beverley, can you at last," cried Mrs. Harrel, "be so barbarous as to retract?" "No, my poor Priscilla," answered Cecilia, "I cannot so cruelly disappoint you. My pity shall however make no sufferer but myself. I cannot send for Mr. Arnott. From me you must have the money, and may it answer the purpose for which it is given, and restore to you the tenderness of your husband, and the peace of your own heart." Priscilla, scarce waiting to thank her, flew with this intelligence to Mr. Harrel, who with the same impetuosity, scarce waiting to say he was glad of it, ran himself to bring the Jew from whom the money was to be procured. Everything was soon settled. Cecilia had no time for retracting, and repentance they had not the delicacy to regard. Again, therefore, she signed her name for paying the principal and interest of another £1,000 within 10 days after she was of age, and having taken the money, she accompanied Mr. and Mrs. Harrel into another room. Presenting it then with an affecting solemnity to Mrs. Harrel, "Accept, Priscilla," she cried, "this irrefragable mark of the sincerity of my friendship, but suffer me at the same time to tell you it is the last to so considerable amount I ever mean to offer. Receive it therefore with kindness, but use it with discretion." She then embraced her, and eager now to avoid acknowledgment, as before she had been to escape importunities, she left them together. The soothing recompense of succouring benevolence followed not this gift, nor made amends for its loss. Perplexity and uneasiness, regret and resentment accompanied the donation, and rested upon her mind. She feared she had done wrong. She was certain Mr. Monckton would blame her. He knew not the persecution she suffered, nor would he make any allowance for the threats which alarmed or the entreaties which melted her. Far other had been her feelings at the generosity she exerted for the Hills. No doubts then tormented her, and no repentance embittered her beneficence. Their worth was without suspicion, and their misfortunes were not of their own seeking. The post in which they had been stationed they had never deserted, and the poverty into which they had sunk was accidental and unavoidable. But here every evil had been wantonly incurred by vanity and licentiousness, and shamelessly followed by injustice and fraud. The disturbance of her mind only increased by reflection, for when the rights of the creditors with their injuries occurred to her, she inquired of herself by what title or equity she had so liberally assisted Mr. Harrel in eluding their claims, and flying the punishment which the law would inflict. Startled by this consideration, she most severely reproached herself for a compliance of which she had so lightly weighed the consequences, and thought with the utmost dismay that while she had flattered herself she was merely indulging the dictates of humanity, she might perhaps be accused by the world as an abettor of guile and injustice. "And yet," she continued, "whom can I essentially have injured but myself? Would his creditors have been benefited by my refusal? Had I braved the execution of his dreadful threat, and quitted his house before I was wrought upon to assist him, would his suicide have lessened their losses, or secured their demands? Even if he had no intention but to intimidate me, who will be wronged by my enabling him to go abroad, or who would be better paid were he seized and confined? All that remains of his shattered fortune may still be claimed, though I have saved him from a lingering imprisonment, desperate for himself and his wife, and useless for those he has plundered." And thus, now soothed by the purity of her intentions, and now uneasy from the rectitude of her principles, she alternately rejoiced and repined at what she had done. At dinner Mr. Harrel was all civility and good humour. He warmly thanked Cecilia for the kindness she had shown him, and gaily added, "You should be absolved from all the mischief you may do for a 12-month to come, in reward for the preservation from mischief which you have this day effected." "The preservation," said Cecilia, "will, I hope, be for many days. But tell me so exactly at what time I may acquaint Mrs. Delvile I shall wait upon her." "Perhaps," he answered, "by 8 o'clock, perhaps by 9. You will not mind half an hour?" "Certainly not," she answered, unwilling by disputings about a trifle to diminish his satisfaction in her assistance. She wrote therefore another note to Mrs. Delvile, desiring she would not expect her till near 10 o'clock, and promising to account and apologise for these seeming caprices when she had the honour of seeing her. The rest of the afternoon she spent wholly in exhorting Mrs. Harrel to show more fortitude, and conjuring her to study nothing while abroad but economy, prudence, and housewifery. A lesson how hard for the thoughtless and negligent Priscilla. She heard the advice with repugnance, and only answered it with helpless complaints that she knew not how to spend less money than she had always done. After tea, Mr. Harrel, still in high spirits, went out, entreating Cecilia to stay with Priscilla till his return, which he promised should be early. 9 o'clock, however, came, and he did not appear. Cecilia then grew anxious to keep her appointment with Mrs. Delvile, but 10 o'clock also came, and still Mr. Harrel was absent. She then determined to wait no longer, and rang her bell for her servant and chair. But when Mrs. Harrel desired to be informed the moment Mr. Harrel returned, the man said he had come home more than half an hour. Much surprised, she inquired where he was. In his own room, madam, and gave orders not to be disturbed. Cecilia, who was not much pleased at this account, was easily persuaded to stay a few minutes longer, and fearing some new evil, she was going to send him a message, by way of knowing how he was employed, when he came himself into the room. "Well, ladies," he cried in a hurrying manner, "who is for Vauxhall?" "Vauxhall?" repeated Mrs. Harrel, while Cecilia, staring, perceived in his face a look of perturbation that extremely alarmed her. "Come, come," he cried, "we have no time to lose. A hackney coach will serve us. We won't wait for our own." "Have you then given up going abroad?" said Mrs. Harrel. "No, no, where can we go from half so well? Let us live while we live. I have ordered a chaise to be waiting there. Come, let's be gone." "First," said Cecilia, "let me wish you both good night." "Will you not go with me?" cried Mrs. Harrel. "How can I go to Vauxhall alone?" "You are not alone," answered she, "but if I go, how am I to return?" "She shall return with you," cried Mr. Harrel, "if you desire it. You shall return together." Mrs. Harrel, starting up in rapture, called out, "Oh, Mr. Harrel, will you indeed leave me in England?" "Yes," answered he reproachfully, "if you will make a better friend than you have made a wife, and if Miss Beverley is content to take charge of you." "What can all this mean?" exclaimed Cecilia. "Is it possible you can be serious? Are you really going yourself, and will you suffer Mrs. Harrel to remain?" "I am," he answered, "and I will." Then ringing the bell, he ordered a hackney coach. Mrs. Harrel was scarce able to breathe for ecstasy, nor Cecilia for amazement, while Mr. Harrel, attending to neither of them, walked for some time silently about the room. "But how," cried Cecilia at last, "can I possibly go? Mrs. Delvile must already be astonished at my delay, and if I disappoint her again, she will hardly receive me." "Oh, make not any difficulties," cried Mrs. Harrel in an agony. "If Mr. Harrel will let me stay, sure you will not be so cruel as to oppose him." "But why," said Cecilia, "should either of us go to Vauxhall? Surely that is no place for a parting so melancholy." A servant then came in, and said the hackney coach was at the door. Mrs. Harrel, starting at the sound, called out, "Come, what do we wait for? If we go not immediately, we may be prevented." Cecilia then again wished them good night, protesting she could fail Mrs. Delvile no longer. Mrs. Harrel, half wild at this refusal, conjured her in the most frantic manner not to give way, exclaiming, "Oh, cruel, cruel, to deny me this last request! I will kneel to you day and night," sinking on the ground before her, "and I will serve you in the humblest of your slaves, if you will but be kind in this last instance and save me from banishment and misery." "Oh, rise, Mrs. Harrel," cried Cecilia, ashamed of her protestation and shocked by her vehemence. "Rise and let me rest. It is painful for me to refuse, but to comply for ever in defiance of my judgment. Oh, Mrs. Harrel, I know no longer what is kind or what is cruel, nor have I known for some time past right from wrong, nor good from evil." "Come," cried Mr. Harrel impetuously, "I will wait not another minute." "Leave her then with me," said Cecilia. "I will perform my promise. Mr. Arnott will, I am sure, hold his to be sacred. She shall now go with him, she shall hereafter come to me. Leave her but behind, and depend upon our care." "No, no," cried he with quickness, "I must take care of her myself. I shall not carry her abroad with me, but the only legacy I can leave her is a warning which I hope she will remember for ever. You, however, need not go." "What!" cried Mrs. Harrel, Leave me at Vauxhall, and yet leave me alone? What of that? Cried he with fierceness. Do you not desire to be left? Have you any regard for me, or for anything upon earth but yourself? Cease these vain clamours, and come, I insist upon it, this moment. And then with a violent oath he declared he would be detained no longer, and approached in great rage to seize her. Mrs. Harrel shrieked aloud, and the terrified Cecilia exclaimed, If indeed you are to part to-night, part not thus dreadfully. Rise, Mrs. Harrel, and comply. Be reconciled, be kind to her, Mr. Harrel, and I will go with her myself. We will all go together. And why, cried Mr. Harrel, more gently yet with the utmost emotion, why should you go? You want no warning, you need no terror. Better far had you fly us, and my wife, when I am set out, you may find. Better far had you fly us, and my wife, when I am set out, may find you. Mrs. Harrel, however, suffered her not to recede, and Cecilia, though half distracted by the scenes of horror and perplexity in which she was perpetually engaged, ordered her servant to acquaint Mrs. Delvile she was again compelled to defer waiting upon her. Mr. Harrel then hurried them both into the coach, which he directed to Vauxhall. Pray write to me when you are landed, said Mrs. Harrel, who, now released from her personal apprehensions, began to feel some for her husband. He made not any answer. She then asked to what part of France he meant to go, but still he did not reply, and when she urged him by a third question, he told her in a rage to torment him no more. During the rest of the ride not another word was said. Mrs. Harrel wept, her husband guarded a gloomy silence, and Cecilia most unpleasantly passed her time between anxious suspicion of some new scheme and a terrified wonder in what all these transactions would terminate. Well, the next chapter is almost 20 pages, so I will save that for a future occasion. This chapter, I think, is quite extraordinary, and it was mentioned in the introduction that really the kind of characterization of Cecilia here is something that's quite novel in the novel. Her statement, I know no longer what is kind or what is cruel, nor have I known for some time past right from wrong nor good from evil. That Cecilia is acknowledging that she doesn't know how to behave, but more than that, that there is perhaps no correct answer, that there is no obvious way of behaving, that it is not clear what she should do, what is morally correct. Heroines in novels of this period have to be good, have to be pure, have to be perfect. But Cecilia is not just admitting that she is none of those things, but also that perhaps it is impossible for a person to do that, to do the correct acts. And so that's really quite extraordinary, I think, in terms of the development of characterization in the novel. Anyway, be prepared. The next chapter is, shall we say, highly dramatic. And thank you if you are still engaged in this and you are still listening. Thank you, and once again I apologise for not having updated in so long. Good night.